October 1945. A small dock in San Francisco Bay. American MPs are preparing to send Japanese prisoners of war back home to Japan. The war is over. These men should be celebrating their return. But something strange is happening. A young Japanese soldier, barely 20 years old, stands at the gangplank. He's holding his duffel bag. Tears are streaming down his face. An American sergeant approaches him, confused. "What's wrong, soldier? You're going home." The young man looks up, and in broken English he says something the sergeant will never forget. "I do not want to leave. This place. Paradise. Paradise." He called an American prisoner of war camp paradise. That sergeant told his grandchildren that story 50 years later, and he still couldn't quite believe it. But he wasn't alone. Thousands of American guards, officers, and civilians witnessed the same thing in 1945 and 1946. Japanese prisoners begging to stay. Some even refusing to board ships home. What happened in those camps? What did these Japanese soldiers experience that made them fear going home more than they feared captivity? The answer reveals one of the most profound and least known stories of World War II. To understand this story, we need to go back. Back to the culture that shaped these young men before they ever set foot on a battlefield. In the 1920s and 1930s, Japan underwent a radical transformation. The military took control of Japanese society, and with it came a revival of ancient warrior codes twisted into something dark and unforgiving. The philosophy was called Bushido, the way of the warrior. But this wasn't the honorable code of medieval samurai. This was something else entirely. This was a death cult dressed in the armor of tradition. Every Japanese soldier was taught from his first day of training: death before dishonor. Surrender was not just discouraged, it was the ultimate shame, worse than death, worse than anything imaginable. The military handbook given to every Japanese soldier, called the Senjinkun, or Instructions for the Battlefield, stated it clearly. Never suffer the shame of being taken alive as a prisoner. Think about that for a moment. These were teenage boys, young men barely out of school, being told that if they were captured, they would bring eternal shame upon their families. Their names would be stricken from family records. Their parents would hold funeral services for them. In the eyes of their nation, their families, their ancestors, they would be dead. Worse than dead, erased. One Japanese officer who survived the war later wrote, "We were taught that to be captured was to cease to exist as a human being. You became a ghost, a non-person, something without honor or worth." This wasn't just military propaganda. It was woven into the fabric of Japanese wartime society. Mothers sent their sons off to war with a phrase that haunts history: "Come back victorious, or don't come back at all." The result was predictable and horrific. Japanese soldiers fought with suicidal fury. Guadalcanal, August 1942. The first major American offensive in the Pacific. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, a Marine who would later write one of the most powerful memoirs of the Pacific War, remembered the first time his unit captured a Japanese soldier. The man was badly wounded, barely conscious. The Marines gave him water and called for a medic. The Japanese soldier opened his eyes, saw he was surrounded by Americans, and began to scream. Not in pain, in horror. He thrashed against the Marines trying to help him. He begged them in Japanese to kill him. When they wouldn't, he tried to tear open his own wounds. The Marines were stunned. They had been prepared for a lot of things, but not this. Not a man terrified of being saved. An interpreter finally arrived. Through the interpreter, the soldier kept repeating the same thing. "I am dead. I am already dead. Let me die." This scene repeated itself across the Pacific theater. American soldiers and Marines were capturing enemies who genuinely believed they would be tortured to death. They had been told by their officers that Americans were barbarians who would mutilate prisoners, that they would be burned alive, that they would suffer fates worse than any battlefield death. So imagine their shock when, instead, they were given medical treatment. When American medics, the same medics who had just been trying to save wounded American boys, worked just as hard to save Japanese soldiers. When they were given food, water, blankets, and shelter. On Saipan in 1944, a Marine captain named John Wilson watched as a Japanese soldier was carried into an aid station. The man's leg was shattered. He would need amputation to survive. The Japanese soldier lay there, eyes wide with terror, waiting for the torture to begin. They charged machine gun nests. They strapped bombs to themselves. They held grenades to their own chests rather than surrender. On islands across the Pacific, American soldiers watched in horror as wounded Japanese soldiers would crawl toward them with live grenades, choosing to take their enemies with them rather than accept capture. And those who did surrender? Those who were too wounded, too exhausted, too starved to resist anymore? They believed they were already dead. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had committed the unforgivable sin. They had survived when they should have died. A Navy surgeon, a doctor from Ohio named Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, walked over. He had been operating for 18 hours straight. American boys kept coming in, torn apart by Japanese shells and bullets. He was exhausted. He had every reason to feel hatred. Instead, he put his hand on the Japanese soldier's shoulder and spoke through an interpreter. "You're safe now. We're going to fix that leg. You're going to be okay." The Japanese soldier stared at him. Then, in front of a tent full of battle-hardened Marines, this enemy combatant, this man who hours earlier had been trying to kill Americans, began to weep. Not from pain, from disbelief. The main Japanese prisoner of war camps in the United States were spread across the country. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico, and the largest, Camp Kennedy in Texas, which, at its peak, held over 5,000 Japanese prisoners. When the first Japanese POWs arrived at these camps in late 1942 and early 1943, they came prepared to die. They had said goodbye to life. They arrived expecting torture chambers and starvation rations. What they found instead defied everything they had been told about Americans. The camps were run according to the Geneva Convention. That meant prisoners received the same rations as American soldiers, the same food, the same portions. In many cases, the same meals. Let me give you some perspective here. In 1943, American soldiers were eating around 3,000 calories a day. Fresh meat, vegetables, bread, butter, milk, coffee. This was considered standard military rations. Japanese soldiers on the front lines, they were lucky to get 1,500 calories, usually rice and whatever they could forage. By 1944, on islands cut off from supply, Japanese soldiers were eating tree bark, grass, and in some documented cases, resorting to cannibalism. So when a Japanese prisoner arrived at an American camp and was handed a tray with pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and coffee, it was like something from a dream or a cruel joke. They kept waiting for it to be taken away. It wasn't. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a guard at Camp Kennedy, remembered one prisoner's first meal. This guy just stared at the tray. He looked around like we were tricking him. Then he picked up the fork, took one bite, and just stopped. He set the fork down and put his hands over his face. He was crying. I'd never seen anything like it. Here's this enemy soldier, crying over a plate of food. But it wasn't just the food. It was everything. The prisoners were given clean barracks with real beds, mattresses, and blankets. They had access to showers with hot water. Hot water. Many Japanese soldiers hadn't had a hot shower in years. They were given clean clothes, medical care, and even recreational activities. The U.S. government provided sports equipment. Baseball became incredibly popular in the camps. The prisoners organized teams and leagues. They were given materials to make traditional crafts. They could write letters home, though many didn't, fearing the shame it would bring their families. And here's something that shocked the prisoners more than anything. They were paid for their work. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to work, but they had to be paid. Japanese POWs working on farms or in camp kitchens received 80 cents a day in camp scrip. They could use this money to buy cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other items from the camp store. 80 cents a day doesn't sound like much. But to these men, many of whom came from poor farming villages, who had been conscripted and sent to fight with no pay at all, it was wealth beyond imagination. They were prisoners, and they were earning more than they had as soldiers in the Imperial Japanese Army. At Camp Clarinda in Iowa, something remarkable happened. The camp needed repairs on several buildings. The American commander asked for volunteers among the prisoners. Every single prisoner volunteered. Over 1,000 men. The commander was stunned. These were enemy soldiers volunteering to improve their own prison. When asked why through interpreters, the prisoners gave an answer that left the Americans speechless. "You have treated us with honor. We wish to repay this honor." But the story goes deeper than just physical comfort. Something profound was happening in these camps. Something that would change these men forever. Many of the camp guards were Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans who spoke fluent Japanese. These men had themselves faced discrimination, and many had family in internment camps. Yet they had volunteered to serve in the U.S. military to prove their loyalty to America. These Nisei soldiers became bridges between two worlds. They could speak to the prisoners, not just in their language, but in their culture. They could explain America in terms the prisoners could understand. Private Takeshi Yamamoto, a Nisei interpreter at Camp McCoy, remembered long conversations with prisoners. They couldn't understand why we were treating them well. They had been told that Americans were devils, that we had no honor, no culture, no humanity. But here they were, being treated better than they had ever been treated by their own military. It broke something in them, in a good way. The prisoners began to ask questions. Questions about America, about democracy, about freedom, about a system where a farm boy from Iowa and the son of a millionaire could serve side by side as equals. About a place where you could criticize your government without disappearing in the night. about a country where your worth wasn't determined by your family name or your willingness to die for the emperor. At Camp Kennedy, an American chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, started holding informal discussion groups. He didn't preach. He didn't try to convert anyone. He just talked. About American history, about the Constitution, about the idea that all men are created equal. A Japanese prisoner named Kazuo Yamamoto, a former elementary school teacher, attended these sessions. After the war, he wrote a memoir. In it, he described his first discussion with Father O'Brien. He told us that in America, the government serves the people, not the other way around. I thought this was impossible. I thought he was lying or confused. How can a nation function if the leaders serve those below them? It violated everything I understood about order and hierarchy. But then I looked around at the camp, at the American soldiers who treated us with respect, at the system that gave us food, shelter, and dignity, even though we had been their enemies, at guards who learned our language and our customs to better communicate with us. And I realized, this is what it looks like when leaders serve the people. This is what it creates. For the first time in my life, I understood that I had value as a human being. Not because of my service to the emperor, not because of my willingness to die, but simply because I existed. This was a revolutionary idea. It changed everything. Sports became more than just recreation. They became lessons in democracy. The prisoners organized their own baseball leagues with elected commissioners. They held debates about rules and settled disputes through voting. For men who had lived their entire lives in a rigid military hierarchy, where every decision came from above, the idea that they could have a voice, a vote, a choice, was intoxicating. Mail call became an unexpected emotional battleground. Some prisoners did receive letters from home, smuggled through Red Cross channels. But many of these letters carried a consistent message. You are dead to us. Families had held funerals. Names had been removed from family registries. The prisoners had ceased to exist in their homeland. One prisoner, Hiroshi Sato, received a letter from his mother. It contained a single sentence. The son I knew died with honor at Guadalcanal. I do not know who you are. Sato showed the letter to Sergeant Torres, his barrack supervisor. Torres remembered. He handed me this letter, and I could see it was tearing him apart. But then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "In Japan, I am dead. But here, in this camp, I am alive. I am treated as a man. Which is the prison, and which is freedom?" August 15, 1945. The war ended. Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese nation for the first time in history, announcing surrender. In the camps, American officers gathered the prisoners to give them the news. They expected celebration, relief, joy. Instead, they saw confusion and fear. The prisoners had 1,000 questions. Would they be executed now? Would they be sent back to Japan to be executed there? What would happen to them? The American commanders assured them they would be treated well during the repatriation process, and they would be returned home safely. Home. That word landed like a bomb. For 3 years, these men had been living in a world where they had value, where they were fed, clothed, treated with dignity, where they could laugh, play sports, learn, grow, where they were paid for their work, where they could express opinions, where they were safe. And now they were being sent back to a country that considered them dead. to families that had disowned them, to a society that would mark them forever as cowards, to a nation in ruins, starving, occupied by foreign troops, everything they had known destroyed. At Camp Kennedy, a riot nearly broke out. Not a violent riot, but something perhaps more shocking. Hundreds of prisoners gathered and respectfully but firmly told the camp commander they did not want to leave. They wanted to stay in America. They wanted to live here, work here, become Americans. Captain James Whitmore, the camp commander, was moved but had no authority to grant such requests. The policy was clear. All prisoners would be repatriated. "It broke my heart," he wrote to his wife. These men had become friends. They had worked hard, learned English, embraced American values. They wanted to be Americans, and we were sending them back to a place that would hate them for surviving. The repatriation process took months. Starting in late 1945 and continuing through 1946, Japanese prisoners were processed, given new clothes, given pay for any work they had done, and put on ships bound for Japan. The scenes at the docks were remarkable. American guards who had spent years watching these prisoners, working alongside them, getting to know them as individuals, lined up to shake their hands. Many guards were crying. So were many prisoners. Gifts were exchanged. Prisoners gave guards handcrafted items they had made, carved wooden figures, origami, paintings. Guards gave prisoners photographs, addresses, promises to write. Private Yamamoto, the Nisei interpreter, remembered walking through the barracks as prisoners were packing. One man, I had known him for 2 years, called me over. He handed me a small wooden box he had carved. Inside was a letter. He asked me to keep it safe and maybe someday show it to Americans, so they would understand what had happened here. He said, "Tell them that we were enemies, but you made us human again. Tell them that we were prepared to hate, but you taught us to hope." The ships arrived in Japan to find a country that no longer existed. The Japan these men had left was a powerful empire, convinced of its divine destiny. The Japan they returned to was a smoking ruin. Cities had been firebombed into ashes. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been erased by atomic weapons. Millions were homeless and starving. The emperor had been revealed as a mortal man, not a god. Everything they had believed in had been shattered. And into this devastation came men who had been in America, who had been fed while Japan starved, who had been safe while Japan burned, who had survived while millions had died. The shame was crushing. Many returning prisoners lied about their experiences. They claimed they had been tortured, starved, beaten. They couldn't tell the truth. How could they explain that they had eaten better, slept better, lived better as prisoners in America than they ever had as soldiers in the Imperial Japanese Army? Who would believe them? Who would forgive them? Some changed their names. Others moved to different parts of Japan where no one knew them. Many never spoke about the war at all, not to their children, not to their grandchildren. The experience became a secret, buried deep. But others couldn't let it go. They had seen something in America that haunted them. They had experienced a different way of living, a different way of thinking about human worth and dignity. And they had to find a way to bring that home. Kazuo Yamamoto, the school teacher, began writing textbooks for Japanese children. In them, he subtly introduced ideas about democracy, about individual rights, about the value of every human life. He couldn't directly credit his time in an American POW camp, but those ideas, those values, they seeped into his work. Hiroshi Sato, the man whose mother had disowned him, became a translator for the American occupation forces. He worked to help rebuild Japan according to democratic principles. He married an American woman he met during the occupation. When asked years later why he had dedicated his life to building bridges between America and Japan, he said simply, "Because someone once showed me that enemies can become friends, and slaves can become free men. I wanted to pass that gift forward." To truly understand why Japanese prisoners called American camps paradise, we need to look at the other side of the coin. We need to talk about what happened to Allied prisoners in Japanese camps. The statistics are horrific. Of the approximately 140,000 American, British, Australian, and other Allied prisoners captured by Japan during World War II, more than 1 in 4 died in captivity. That's a death rate of 27%. In German POW camps, the death rate for American and British prisoners was less than 1%. Allied prisoners in Japanese camps were starved deliberately. They were beaten routinely. They were worked to death building railroads and infrastructure. They were subjected to medical experiments. They were denied medical care. They were tortured for entertainment. The camps were designed not just to hold prisoners, but to break them, to destroy them. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, Unit 731. These names represent some of the darkest chapters in human history. Allied prisoners were treated as something less than human, as tools to be used until they broke and then discarded. And this wasn't a failure of the system. This was the system working as designed. The Japanese military's philosophy treated surrender as the ultimate sin. If you surrendered, you were weak, worthless, deserving of contempt. The Japanese soldiers guarding Allied prisoners had been taught their entire lives that prisoners were beneath dignity, beneath honor, beneath humanity. So when Japanese soldiers became prisoners themselves and were treated with dignity, with respect, with humanity, it shattered their worldview. Everything they had been taught was revealed as a lie. American guards at POW camps weren't saints. There were incidents of mistreatment, of guards who couldn't overcome their hatred for an enemy that had killed their friends. But the system, the official policy, the Geneva Convention guidelines that governed the camps, demanded humane treatment. And by and large, that's what prisoners received. One Japanese prisoner, interviewed decades later, put it starkly. "I was taught that Americans were devils, that they had no honor, that they would torture prisoners. But when I became a prisoner, I was treated better than I had been treated by my own officers. I had more food, more freedom, more dignity as an American prisoner than I had as a Japanese soldier. That taught me that everything I believed was backwards, that I had been serving the devils, and the devils had saved my life." After the war, as the truth about Japanese POW camps became known, as the world learned about the systematic abuse and murder of Allied prisoners, some Americans questioned why we had treated Japanese prisoners so well. Why give comfort to an enemy that had shown no mercy? The answer came from an unlikely source. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, was asked this question directly. His response has echoed through history. "We did not treat Japanese prisoners well because of who they were. We treated them well because of who we are." That statement captures something essential about America at its best. The idea that our values don't change based on circumstance. That dignity and human rights aren't things we extend only to those who deserve them, but things we uphold because they define us. The Japanese prisoners who called American camps paradise weren't praising the barracks or the food, though those things mattered. They were recognizing something deeper. They were recognizing a system that valued human life, that treated even enemies with a baseline of respect, that operated according to rules and laws that applied to everyone. They had lived under a system where their worth was measured by their willingness to die. And then they experienced a system where their worth was inherent, simply because they were human beings. That contrast, that revelation, that was the paradise they spoke of. Today, the story of Japanese POWs in American camps is rarely told. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives of World War II. It complicates our understanding of the Pacific War. It forces us to hold two truths simultaneously: that we fought a necessary war against a brutal enemy, and that we did so while maintaining our humanity. The prisoners who returned to Japan carried these lessons with them, even when they couldn't speak them aloud. The Japan that rose from the ashes of World War II, the democratic, prosperous, peaceful Japan that became one of America's strongest allies, was built in part by men who had seen a different way of organizing society, who had experienced democracy, dignity, and freedom, even in a prison camp, and who wanted to build something similar at home. In 1995, 50 years after the war ended, a group of former Japanese POWs organized a trip to the United States. They visited the sites of the old camps, most of which had been torn down or converted to other uses. They met with former guards, now elderly men like themselves. They shared meals, stories, and tears. One former prisoner, a man in his 70s, gave a speech at a memorial ceremony. He said, "We came to America as enemies. We expected to die. Instead, you taught us how to live. You showed us that even in war, humanity can survive. You gave us the greatest gift. You gave us back our dignity. For 50 years, I have wanted to say thank you. Thank you for treating us not as the enemy, but as men." That is the shocking reason why Japanese prisoners called American camps paradise. Not because they were comfortable, though they were. Not because they were safe, though they were. But because for the first time in their lives, in the middle of the most brutal war in human history, they were treated as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. And once you've experienced that, once you've felt what it means to have inherent worth, you can never go back. You can never unsee it. You can never stop wanting it. Not just for yourself, but for everyone. That is the legacy of the Japanese POW camps in America. That is the untold story. That is the shadow echo of World War II that still resonates today. If this story moved you, if it challenged what you thought you knew about World War II, please hit that subscribe button. Here at WW2 Shadow Echoes, we tell the stories that history forgot. The stories that don't make it into the textbooks, but that reveal profound truths about humanity, about war, and about the choices that define us. Leave a comment. Did you know this story? Did you have a family member who guarded prisoners during the war, or who helped with the repatriation process? Share their stories with us. And remember, history isn't just about what happened. It's about what it reveals about who we are and who we can choose to be. Until next time, this is WW2 Shadow Echoes, bringing light to the shadows of history.